A Brazilian government official who met U.S. President Donald Trump in Florida on Saturday has tested positive for the coronavirus. Fábio Wajngarten, who is the Brazilian president's communications secretary, posed for a picture shoulder to shoulder with Trump. He also met U.S. Vice President Mike Pence. Our correspondent Nick Harper is in Washington D.C. for more on this development. Nick, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. We've seen a Brazilian official who tested positive a couple of days ago, and just today he was in contact with President Donald Trump. Now, the White House is saying that President Trump has absolutely no plans whatsoever to test for coronavirus or even go into self-isolation. Do we know why?
That's right. It's something that he's been pushing all along. I guess it really shows the tone, the bravado that he has put out throughout this crisis, really trying to minimize it, play down the health risks, saying that he will not get tested, saying that he's not concerned about it. But it's not really the type of advice that we're getting from the CDC here in the United States, who are saying that really if you have any symptoms, you should be self-isolating. And of course, if you're able to get tested, then you should be getting tested. But here we have the President of the United States standing firm, saying that that's not something at this stage that he intends to do. At the same time, we're seeing these pictures, these videos all over social media, all over the news channels here throughout the course of the day, him just a few feet away, that staffer from President Bolsonaro's team. So there is, of course, a tremendous concern that having spent a considerable amount of time with that person over the course of the weekend, that he could potentially have passed on that virus, not just to the president, but also to the Vice President Mike Pence. And yet at this stage, the White House is saying they're not concerned, and testing of those two men is not going ahead.
And he'll only declare coronavirus a pandemic after he's invoked the Stafford Act. What's the meaning of this? What is this Stafford Act, and why has it taken the United States so long to declare coronavirus as a pandemic?
Well, it seems, I guess, that really comes from the president. Again, the main message that he has been pushing throughout this, that it isn't something that we should be worrying about. A couple of weeks ago, he was saying that he expected the cases to drop down to zero, and yet we're nearing the 1,300 mark for confirmed cases across the United States. He has throughout contradicted his health officials, and yet we saw him try to, I guess, change the tone in many ways with that Oval Office address during primetime television, an attempt to try and seem presidential, to show that his administration has it under control, even though health officials are saying the exact opposite. The top health official in the United States, Dr. Anthony Fauci, was saying just a few hours ago when he was testifying before Congress that the US was failing when it came to testing kits, that he was particularly concerned that those testing kits were simply not available, even though the Trump administration is saying that by the end of the week there should be somewhere in the region of 4 million test kits out there. So the president trying to change the message, but not exactly going all the way, and instituting a whole range of government and federal policies that perhaps would show that he's taking this very seriously.
And we've seen a bloodbath in the stock markets just after he's pronounced a travel ban. Just how has that affected the stock market?
That's right. Obviously, part of the reason why the president gave that Oval Office address, a reason that he didn't fully say was the reason, was to try and reassure the markets, to give investors confidence that things are under control. And yet, the day after he made that address, we saw the worst day for the Dow in 33 years. It has had its biggest percentage drop since 1987, falling by 10%, an absolute colossal drop. It's now dropped by about 30% over the course of the last month from a record high. The Nasdaq and the S&P also falling dramatically, plummeting about 9.5%. All three of those indices are now in bear market territory, meaning that they've dropped by more than 20% from their record highs. And it doesn't seem as if that freefall will be ending anytime soon. The Federal Reserve has already cut interest rates by half in the course of the last week. It's already introduced a stimulus package of more than $1 trillion. They meet again next week, and the expectation is there could be another massive rate cut, really to try and add confidence, to shore up the economy, at the same time that the president is trying to introduce economic measures that he hopes will give people more money to spend, things like tax cuts, things like low interest loans to businesses.
And President Trump said the United Kingdom was also excluded from this travel ban because the United Kingdom is doing a pretty good job in controlling this disease. Are the other countries not doing a pretty good job in containing this disease? Well, notwithstanding the infection figures, of course.
Well, yes, there doesn't seem to be any tremendous rhyme or reason as to why he's decided certain countries are exempt. The United Kingdom, Ireland, both of them are exempt. Some of the European countries have also got exceptions, even though there is really nothing stopping someone on the continent of Europe from crossing by a ferry or by the underground rail tunnel into the United Kingdom and jumping on a flight and travelling here to the US. There's also exemptions for all US travellers currently in Europe. President Trump saying that they will be tested vigorously, except there doesn't seem to be any suggestion that there are those testing kits available for those Americans when they arrive back on US soil. So there are some exemptions in place, and yet more than 26 or so countries have been placed under that lockdown, meaning that for the next 30 days from midnight on Friday, they will not be able to fly to the US.
Do you get the impression that President Trump and his administration are very serious about coronavirus and the containment thereof? Because just a couple of days ago, he was accusing the Democrats and the media of inflaming the coronavirus and, I beg your pardon, and he dismissed it as a glorified cold or flu and said as recently as Tuesday that it will just go away and the Americans should just remain calm.
Well, that presidential address was part of that trying to seem serious about the situation. And yet he is continuing that blame game. You mentioned the Democrats that he's been blaming up until now, the media that he's been blaming for, quote, weaponizing this virus to try and make sure that he doesn't get re-elected in November. And in that presidential address in the Oval Office, he found another target. He blamed the Europeans. He said that they hadn't done a good enough job in the early stages of this outbreak in shutting down travel from China, and they had therefore brought the virus here into the United States. He created very much an us and them type narrative, also using some very dangerous language, calling this a foreign virus, not something that other governments are saying, certainly not something that the World Health Organization is saying. They're saying that this is a worldwide pandemic, something that everyone has a responsibility to try and get on top of. And yet here we have President Trump really trying to point the finger at other people, non-Americans, saying that they are behind this, that they are a part of spreading it around the world.
And the fact that he keeps on pointing a finger at other people and calling this virus a foreign disease and a glorified cold or flu, and the fact that most Americans see so much complacency coming from his administration, particularly the White House, do you get the sense that Americans will or will not taking the necessary precautions to prevent the spread of coronavirus?
I think what we're seeing is civil society stepping in here. We're seeing on a local level, on a state level, organisations and authorities taking the steps that the national government isn't. So we're seeing a number of states instituting a state of emergency. That essentially means that they're able to release funds and resources much more easily to be able to deal with the problems. In New York, during the course of the day, we've seen a lot of orders put in place, the state of emergency being called in New York City with a population of more than 8 million people. The governor of New York State also saying that he's preventing any large-scale gatherings of more than 500 people from happening after 5 p.m. on Friday, but also shutting down Broadway. That is due to start in just 30 minutes' time, really only giving theatre-goers about a few hours' notice that Broadway will be shut indefinitely. We have seen universities closing right across the United States, telling their students to stay away for several weeks, and we're beginning to see school closures as well. So I think the average American out there is seeing these moves being put in place by local and state authorities, and therefore realizing that we have a serious situation ongoing. They're not complacent, but they are, of course, looking to the government, to the federal government, to the Trump administration for some sort of guidance. That essentially is what a president should be doing, leading the nation. And they might be looking at him, knowing that there is a re-election just around the corner in November, and feeling that they're not getting the type of leadership and the type of direction that they feel they're owed.
And speaking of elections, and if, God forbid, the infection rates rise to unprecedented levels, is there a likelihood that President Trump might impose, a travel ban within regions and within states? And will that affect his election campaign?
Well, certainly, yes. I mean, we've already seen it affect the election in the fact that the two largely remaining Democrat candidates, Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, have had to go ahead and cancel events, a debate that's due to happen with them on Sunday. The first two head-to-head debate between the two of them will happen not in front of a live TV audience, but instead just in front of the moderators and broadcast on television. There is the likelihood that Donald Trump's large campaign rallies that he loves to have right across the United States will simply not happen, because thousands of people all in one room is not exactly what health officials are recommending. There is certainly that potential that it will limit the ability of any of the candidates to get out and meet the voters. And of course, for the president himself, seeking re-election, a president who's tied himself very much to the economy, who has built and staked his reputation and his presidency on the economy, on Wall Street, on the stock market and on the jobs market, if things continue to take a dramatic downward spiral, it will make his ability to say that he's done well with the economy during his presidency very hard, and it may have a serious impact on his ability to try and get re-elected.
Correspondent Nick Harper joining us live from Washington, D.C. and giving us an update with regards to the Washington's and the White House response to coronavirus. Thank you so much for your time. Much appreciated.